I'm an independent consultant as an affiliate for Berkeley Labs, so you know, we can wade into those waters if you want, but don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, of course. I'm going to be talking about grid resilience plans for regulated utilities and how commissions around the country have created those requirements to file resilience plans. So for state energy offices, it's not going to be as much of a focus for my presentation, but there is a key recommendation related to this weather data issue that came up in a couple of questions, and so we should talk about that. And North Carolina is not the only state that has that type of data. I'll show some examples of that and talk about that as well. But state energy offices as well can get involved in grid resilience planning processes as a stakeholder, and they're also working on the state energy security plans, which can align very closely. And so this presentation, while it focuses on what commissions can do mostly, there's still a role and good coverage of best practices related to resilience planning that could be relevant to everybody here. So to start off with, we just really got to look at the fact that 2023 was just a really bad year for weather and climate related disasters. Ended up being the worst on record, and that is inflation adjusted. And that didn't even include any wildfires out west. And so we could just see how it's like a whack-a-mole kind of thing. You see a lot of wildfires out west one year, and it makes that the worst year, and then you see a lot of storms and other major disasters that lead to 2023 then being the worst year, including a lot of storms in more of the middle part of the country that we're in here. And this is a problem that expands across the country. All 50 states have been impacted by at least one of these billion-dollar disasters in the past 10 years, including Hawaii, which had the horrible fire on Maui Island in August. To boot, 2023 was the hottest year on record worldwide. It wasn't the hottest for the US, but it was very close, and we're seeing continued issues with major heat waves and how that stresses the system and leads to major resilience issues. And so as part of the work I'm doing with Lisa at Berkeley Lab, we scanned across the country to look at how states are responding with resilience planning requirements for regulated utilities. And so here's our map here. And in the blue, you'll see the states that have requirements that are final, and the utility plans have already been filed. So you can go to those commission websites or our report that's forthcoming and see a lot of those resilience plan requirements, as well as the plans that have come out of those states. In the orange here, you have Michigan and Colorado, which are states that have final resilience planning requirements, and the utility plans are available, but the resilience requirements are part of distribution system plans. So it's not a standalone resilience plan, it's part of the distribution system plans. In green here, we have Texas and Connecticut, and those are states that have finalized resilience plan requirements for regulated utilities, but the plans are pending. And I think we'll see a lot of those plans coming out of Texas this year, particularly after the wildfire that they had, and the planning requirements just being finalized about a month ago, actually. And finally, we have Louisiana here in yellow, which is still going through the process of finalizing their requirements. And so we've also noted in a couple cases where these requirements may apply to co-ops or utilities, co-ops or municipal utilities. But in most cases, those requirements are kind of like a lighter version of the requirements for regulated utilities. And so that's the focus of this presentation. And as I mentioned, we also, all the state energy offices are aware, have the energy security plans that were part of IIJA. I think a lot of those have been finalized now, but it's important to point them out because they really should be the foundation of grid investment resilience planning and align with any sort of resilience plan that utilities are developing in your states in terms of aligning the methods, data sources, and priorities. Because if the state energy plan has all of this very deep analysis across the energy system, including gas and other utilities, then the electric utility resilience plans can build off of that ideally. So Berkeley Lab is planning to publish a resilience planning framework, which you can see the first page of it here on the left. And that's going to be a standardized template that commissions can use to basically take it and adapt it to develop resilience planning requirements for your state, if that's something you're considering doing. And the idea of having this standardized template is not necessarily to say that you have to use that template everywhere. It's that you can adapt it. And then ultimately, once you adapt that template to your state and provide it to the utilities in your state as a set of requirements for developing a resilience plan, it can facilitate the plan, facilitate development of plan requirements, assists with the review of prepared plans, because when you have a very detailed template of saying exactly what the format of the plan needs to be and what needs to be included, then you can facilitate and assist in that review process. And then finally, by having this standard format that states can adapt, it can help have that standardization for the utilities in your state and reduce that overall burden of review. Because if you get a bunch of plans that are all in a completely different format, it's just going to make it harder to review. I can see some head nodding. I imagine many of you have dealt with that issue before. And Lisa, I did want to make sure to kick it to you to mention when the report and template may be available for review.
Yeah, I mentioned yesterday that we'll be sending it at the end of this on the 22nd to you, and that there's a copy of the draft material with the template for comments in a couple weeks, and I'd love to hear from you.
Oh, okay. Great. Yeah, so the draft has been provided for me to Lisa, and it's going under review, and then, so we're getting close. So now I'm going to get into resilience planning requirements and emerging best practices. And here is a look at southern states. They're all Gulf states. So we broke out the country into these different regions, but if you look at the south, it's really the Gulf states that have been impacted by storms that have started to develop these resilience planning requirements. And so we have Florida, Louisiana, New Orleans, and Texas. And Texas and Louisiana are interesting because even though the impetus for the requirements, if you look at like the press releases from the states, the impetus talks about major storms, increasing restoration costs, and as well as outages to customers and how they're very catastrophic. But their requirements don't only just focus on storms, they allow utilities to assess what are the vulnerabilities for their system and potentially include cybersecurity or other types of hazards in their resilience plans. But I anticipate a lot of the plans that'll be forthcoming in Texas will focus a lot on storms and now, particularly in West Texas, wildfires as well. In northern states, extreme weather is also the focus of resilience planning requirements. And in a lot of cases, it's just when they're developing those requirements, that's the only hazard that they're focused on is the storms that have been coming up and hitting Connecticut as well as New Jersey. New Jersey includes cybersecurity in these requirements that go back many years to Superstorm Sandy, actually. But if you look at the plans that the utilities have put together on those requirements, it doesn't even really talk about cybersecurity from what I saw. And then New York has a broader climate change vulnerability study and resilience plan process. Con Ed has done these studies, including before these requirements in partnership with ICF. So we'll have an example of that in the later slides. But still the focus is really on severe weather and how we have this increasing frequency and severity of severe weather due to climate change. And finally, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but out west, wildfire has been the major focus, particularly outside of California. And so you see these very urgent planning processes that have been developed in response to particularly PG&E's bankruptcy. That tends to get a lot of attention, and that has created a lot of these wildfire-focused plans that you see around the country. And you can see that a lot of those plans have a much shorter planning horizon of just like 3 years, and there's a lot of process-related elements. If you are going to de-energize lines, how do you communicate that to customers? How do you respond to emergencies and coordinate with emergency responders? And so there's a lot of process-related elements to these wildfire mitigation plans, and they tend to have a shorter planning horizons. And in California, they're actually updated annually. So there's already been thousands and thousands of pages of plans for the utilities in California over the course of the last few years. So now I'm going to get into emerging best practices for resilience plan requirements. So first off, you really got to think about the hazards that are going to be in scope, right? You don't just want to say, hey, utilities, give me a resilience plan. Well, you got to really get into detail of what types of hazards are you planning to mitigate, right? And so some policymakers, as I mentioned, in Texas and Louisiana, want to put it on the utility to identify what are those vulnerabilities, right? And not necessarily constrict them to just focus on extreme weather or wildfires. And that's fine, and theoretically, you know, the utility should know what are the worst potential hazards to consider. The plan requirement should really specify that utilities provide a summary of all hazards analyzed and the resulting vulnerability assessment. And this is something that's in a lot of FEMA's disaster planning requirements as well, is saying these are all the hazards I considered, here are the hazards that I prioritized, and the resulting vulnerability assessment. Because, you know, for cybersecurity, for example, you might say you can include cybersecurity in your plan, but if the utility doesn't write about cybersecurity at all, you don't know, did they consider it and just didn't prioritize it? Are we good there? Do we need a different set of requirements? And so it's really important to make sure that it's clear in the plans that they considered a certain set of of hazards and what they ended up focusing on and why. In terms of planning horizon and frequency, there's a long-term nature of most resilience investments, right? So we recommend having a planning horizon of at least 10 years. And that's not to say that 5-10 years from now things aren't going to change. You can change that latter portion of the plan when you update it, ideally every 3 to 5 years, as you get more data, particularly around weather and different vulnerabilities and things of that nature. But as I mentioned, the wildfire mitigation plans have had shorter planning horizons. But in California, actually, they started having a separate set of requirements for undergrounding because it does have that very long-term nature. Just undergrounding in a line can take 5 or 10 years. And so if you have a 3-year planning horizon, it's not a great kind of alignment of your planning processes there. Number 3 is to consider the measures in scope and what are the most viable resilience measures. And again, to a certain extent, the utility is very good at understanding what assets may be vulnerable and how to address those assets in terms of specific resilience measures. But it's important to, in any sort of resilience plan requirements, to call out particularly changes to planning and operational practices or processes, because there might be some low-hanging fruit there that you can implement fairly quickly to resolve or mitigate some of the vulnerabilities. And then you can start to pursue more capital-intensive investments in the more medium to longer term. And so as we looked at these requirements around the country, you can see that there's specific measures that are called out. And it's important to tell the utilities, like, we really want you to consider this measure. And in vegetation management, for example, that's not a capital investment, it's a process. It can be implemented, changed, done more frequently, more aggressively. And that's something you can implement quickly. De-energization events, including the protocols and emergency communications, that's something that you want to really have the utilities focus on in the case of wildfires in particular. And in Connecticut, it was interesting because just line worker staffing was a major issue, where they didn't have very good planning processes and operational processes of getting enough line workers into Connecticut when needed. And so that's just a process thing that can be tweaked and changed relatively quickly, at least relative to undergrinding a line. I understand there's a lot of stakeholders involved and challenges there, but these are things you want to look at as well and ask the utilities to consider in a resilience plan, not just the capital investments. And then 4 here, I think There's been a lot of discussion about this today, including in the prior presentation, about having a matrix that summarizes all hazards that were considered and analyzed relative to the assets and processes that, and have a very clearly defined vulnerability matrix, and they just showed one of those, and so I think it's a really great summary of a vulnerability assessment where you say, here are all the hazards, here are the assets or the process areas, and saying, here's the high, low, medium vulnerability, and really have a clearly defined vulnerability rating so everyone can get on the same page of understanding, well, you're saying this is a high vulnerability, why is that? What are the criteria for that? Just a couple more here in terms of best practices to consider, and then there's more in the report. Performance reporting, this is an emerging area. In many cases, the resilience plan requirements just say, hey, utility, you decide what you want to do to measure or you propose metrics, right? I think in a case where the best practices are emerging and you don't really know which metrics to propose, that can be a decent approach, but you really want to start to understand the best practices that are emerging and start to ask utilities to report specific impact-oriented metrics. So this is an interesting line from the requirements in California for wildfire mitigation, which I think you could take with you as you consider these types of requirements. Metrics should focus on the success of mitigation at lowering the risk of catastrophic wildfires and not simply program targets, such as the number of trees removed or wires replaced, right? In the end, you're trying to mitigate this risk, and that can be hard to measure, but when you're considering metrics, you really want to start to dig into understanding that impact, not just, hey, we told you we're going to spend $1 billion, and that's what we did. What was the return you got on that spending? That's really the key question, and should motivate a lot of the metrics that utilities are asked to provide in their resilience plans and provide updates for going forward as they are implementing those plans. Funding support, there's been a lot of discussion about this. Basically, you should include a requirement to seek funding support. It was interesting because Connecticut and Louisiana included almost the identical language in their resilience planning requirements, and it basically says seek every opportunity to find, as they call it, non-ratepayer funds to support this investment. And the Connecticut requirements say that the utility should provide quarterly funding status updates. It's a fluid process, as you were just saying, as you're having these discussions with the DOE or the state energy offices, and so the commission should ask for updates. Doesn't have to be a incredibly formal type of update, but it can be something that's important to track. And then, as promised, when it comes to state energy offices, the climate scenarios and data is just really important to have a standardized data set. And the utility can lead that process, like with Duke, but in other states, California and New York in particular, the state energy offices worked with leading universities in their states to put together a standardized climate data set. So in California, there's a great tool called CalAdapt. I suggest checking it out. Not to say that every state needs to spend tens of millions of dollars in developing something like that, but you can start to see, like, okay, what is like the low-hanging fruit here that we might be able to implement in our state for certain types of hazards or visualizations and data that might really help inform resilience planning processes for utilities in your state. And ensuring consistency is really important, because if one set of utilities is using one forecast and another set of utilities is using another forecast, the differences in what they propose and why may be due just to the forecasts they use, and not necessarily because they're actually need a different set of solutions, basically. So that's just a quick overview of the best practices, and there's more in the report as we were writing it and finalizing it, added some more details there as we dug into more plans around the country. Now we'll just dig into some example utility plans and best practices, and this is framed in the report as what you might expect to see from your utilities if they provide a resilience plan. But I thought it was interesting to go back to this report from 2015, and this is Seattle City Light, a municipal utility, and they did a really great job of just saying, here are our hazards, and here is the path of how that hazard is going to impact these different areas, right? And this visualization you can see in a lot of different reports, and it's just a really great way to say, these are the things we're concerned about, and these are the specific infrastructure areas, as well as operations that may be impacted by those hazards. And this type of visualization, even early on in the process or working with stakeholders, can really help get everyone on the same page to understand with more specificity, what are we concerned about and what is it going to impact, and then what are you going to do about it, right? And this is from the California Department of Water Resources from a few years ago, and I believe Tom talked about this quite a bit in his presentation. But it's a pretty standardized framework now in terms of exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity. That comes together to give you the vulnerability. Importantly though, adaptive capacity should include community adaptive capacity as well, and low-income communities which may not be able to respond to outages as well as some other communities. So it's important to bring in that community element to the adaptive capacity part of the framework as well, not just the adaptive capacity of the infrastructure or process. Here's a look at the Con Ed climate change vulnerability study, and this is the matrix I was describing where it just very clearly lays out, here are the asset areas that we looked at, and here are the major hazards that they were focused on. They didn't do like a high, medium, low type vulnerability rating. It's primary, secondary, and low, and so you can see how this is a great summary of the resulting vulnerability assessment that if utilities in your state are doing this type of assessment, they can provide a summary like this. And this is, we have like a example table in the template that says like, this is what the table should look like basically. And this is actually the table that you just showed, and so thanks for saving me some time here. But yeah, again, the key point here is it's not just assets, it's processes as well that should be considered in terms of making changes. And asset management in this case was one that was seen as highly vulnerable. I'm not sure why some of these other areas are low, but maybe we could talk about that later. And then this is interesting because prioritization is another area like metrics that's emerging in terms of best practices. And I thought this was just a great summary from Tampa Electric as part of their storm protection plans that they have in Florida. And it really just does a great job of saying, okay, here's how much money we could spend on resilience, right? And here is the benefit, the total life cycle net benefits under 3 different storm scenarios, because there's always going to be that uncertainty, right? And so we have average storm, high storm, very high, and they're showing that as you increase the investment, that you start to reach that point of maybe having that optimal budget allocation. And there's a lot of newer tools that are coming out and ways in which you can measure and characterize those benefits, both in a plan and then after the fact with the metrics. But those are 2 emerging areas, and I just thought this was a good summary of how you might go about prioritization and making sure like, okay, we're going to spend $1.6 billion, which is a lot for Tampa Electric, or any utility, but especially Tampa Electric. And why is that? Why did you decide to kind of stop at that point? And I thought it was a good summary of that. So those are some examples from specific utility plans, and now we'll get into the draft plan template. And so this is just an overview, and first we just start with an executive summary asking the utilities that would put together plans based on this template to lay out the objectives and motivation. Definitions are really important, getting on the same page with respect to key definitions: resilience, reliability, resilience event or catastrophic event, and the hazards, right? And getting on the same page on those key definitions is really important for everybody involved. And then, just providing summaries of a lot of the other things that are included in the plan. And then in section 2, for the remainder of the plan, you get into the vulnerability assessment and prioritization approach. We purposely didn't just say like risk assessment, because that can sometimes just be used very broadly. We really want to emphasize the need to kind of have this two-phase approach where you first have the vulnerability assessment, and then you identify and prioritize the solutions that can address those vulnerabilities. And that's, I think, exactly what Duke did, as well as Con Ed and the other utilities in New York that are subject to those requirements there, in addition to the requirements in California, have that two-phase approach. And I think it's a very effective approach for stakeholders too, where they can really focus on one thing first and then focus on how much are we going to spend and why. But this section can also summarize a history of extreme weather events in the service territory, the approach for forecasting the frequency and severity of extreme weather events. So what data did you use if there isn't a standard data set? How do you make sure you're not just having a overly high forecast, right? That question came up before. And then there's a lot more detail. This is just the overview of the template, but you'll be getting that template soon, and you can take a look at it yourself and provide feedback. And then section 3, it gets into a very program by program based approach, and this is something that's been done in the Florida storm protection plans for many years. And I like it because, again, you have this two-phase approach that says, okay, what's the vulnerability? How are you going to prioritize addressing that vulnerability? And then what's the specific program that's going to address it, right? Instead of just this big portfolio of solutions, you have this program by program approach that talks about how each of those vulnerabilities is going to be addressed, and then ideally you have metrics that are tied to each of those programs and how that vulnerability is being mitigated over time. And finally, section 4, pretty standard, projected rate impacts. It's something you really want to have in any plan that involves a very large investment, and particularly in the first 3 years of the plan, right? It might be a 10-year plan or more, but you want to have that more detail in the first 3 years, and then update the plan every 3 to 5 years, as I was saying before, to adjust for changes in the later part of that time frame as new data and information comes in. And we're calling it a standard template in terms of what you can provide to your utilities, and the template in our report is the starting point, but you can adapt it for your utilities based on your objectives, definitions of key terms, the hazards, assets, and practices or processes in scope, and availability of data. If if a standard data set is available, you can specify that utilities use it. If not, you might want to work with the State Energy Office and collaborate there and put together something that can be standardized, working with leading independent experts. And then there's a variety of other considerations here. I think this list has been expanded once we finalize the report, and so you can adapt the template accordingly. Next steps are first off for Berkeley Lab to complete the draft report, which I guess has been completed, at least the first draft, and then iterating through the review process, and having that template be available based on emerging best practices and get that external review. In terms of public utility commissions, we suggest considering the framework that we developed in the template and potentially in close alignment with integrated distribution system plans. So it doesn't necessarily need to be its own standalone resilience plan. It can be integrated into a distribution plan. At a minimum, you should align those plans and not make redundant investments and have everyone proposing, FLISR, for example, or distribution automation, and not coordinating those investments, right? And then finally, state energy offices, as I mentioned, working with leading universities in your state to develop the forecasts for a variety of climate hazards, downscaled for your state. And it's really just a critical step to ensure consistency of data sources and forecasts. And, we've talked a lot about California and New York today, and they do have great examples to point to, but there's climate experts all around the country. Actually, when I was putting together this report, I found a really great YouTube channel from the University of Oklahoma that just lays out exactly how the climate downscaling works, these global climate models. And so I think all around the country you can find really great, passionate climate experts that would love to help out your state. And so there's a link to that YouTube channel actually at the end of this presentation if you're interested. Questions to ask. So I think you all probably want to ask some questions, so I'll just probably leave it here, but I really appreciate the time, and Yeah, fire away. I love having an active group here. So thank you.